The war in Vietnam ended in 1975, but some wars never really end because the decisions that created them keep coming back. Different countries, different enemies, but the same fears, the same strategies, and sometimes the same mistakes. Today, many historians ask a quiet question: is America repeating the lessons it never fully learned? From Vietnam, after the Second World War ended, the world did not become peaceful. Instead, it became tense in a different way. Two superpowers emerged from the ruins of the conflict: the United States and the Soviet Union, both powerful, both suspicious of each other, both convinced that their system would shape the future of the world. This new rivalry became known as the Cold War. It was not fought through direct battles between the two superpowers, at least not openly. Instead, it unfolded through influence, alliances, intelligence operations, and political pressure across the globe. For American leaders in Washington, the spread of communism quickly became the central concern. The Soviet Union was expanding its influence across Eastern Europe. China had fallen to a communist revolution in 1949, and to many policymakers in the United States, these events did not appear isolated. They looked like part of a larger pattern, a dangerous pattern. The fear was not just about one country choosing communism. The fear was that once one country changed sides, its neighbors might soon follow. This idea slowly took shape in political discussions, intelligence briefings, and strategic planning rooms. It became known as the domino theory. The logic seemed simple. If one nation fell to communism, it could trigger a chain reaction across an entire region, like dominoes standing in a line. One falls, then another, and another. To American officials in the 1950s and early 1960s, Southeast Asia looked like a fragile row of dominoes waiting to tip. Vietnam stood near the center of that line. At the time, Vietnam was already divided. The northern half was controlled by a communist government led by Ho Chi Minh. The South was supported by the United States and its allies. What appeared on maps as a small country carried enormous symbolic weight in the global struggle between two competing ideologies. In Washington, leaders believed that if South Vietnam collapsed, the consequences could spread quickly. Laos might follow, then Cambodia, then perhaps Thailand. Some even feared the influence could eventually reach Indonesia or beyond. This fear shaped the way American leaders interpreted nearly every development in the region. Local conflicts were no longer seen as local. Civil wars were viewed as pieces of a much larger geopolitical puzzle. But there was an important problem. Vietnam was not simply a battlefield in a global ideological war. It was also a country with its own long history of resistance against foreign control. For centuries, Vietnamese movements had fought against outside powers. First the Chinese Empire, then the French colonial government, and now, many Vietnamese saw the conflict as another struggle over national independence. Inside Washington, however, that perspective often received less attention. Instead, the Cold War lens dominated the conversation. Intelligence reports warned about communist expansion. Military advisors discussed containment strategies. Political leaders debated credibility and global reputation. If America did not defend South Vietnam, some believed it might send a dangerous message to allies around the world, a signal that American commitments could not be trusted. In this atmosphere, fear began to shape strategy. Not fear of Vietnam itself, but fear of what Vietnam might represent. To many policymakers, the country was no longer just a place on a map. It became a symbol of whether communism would continue spreading across the world. And once that belief took hold, stepping back became increasingly difficult. Because if the first domino was allowed to fall, many feared the rest would follow. By the early 1960s, American involvement in Vietnam had already begun to grow quietly. At first, it did not look like a war. There were no massive troop deployments, no large battles. Instead, the United States sent military advisors. Their mission was simple on paper: train the South Vietnamese army, provide equipment, help stabilize the government in Saigon. But behind the scenes, the situation looked far less stable. South Vietnam's government struggled with corruption, internal rivalries, and weak political legitimacy. In rural areas, Communist guerrilla forces, known as the Viet Cong, were gaining influence. They moved quietly through villages and jungles, building networks of support and resistance. Reports arriving in Washington painted a worrying picture. Each month seemed to bring new warnings. Territory was being lost. The South Vietnamese military appeared disorganized, and political instability in Saigon made long-term planning difficult. American officials began facing a difficult question. If advisors and financial support were not enough, what would be? The answer slowly moved toward deeper involvement. Inside the White House and the Pentagon, meetings became more urgent. Military commanders presented plans. Intelligence analysts discussed possible risks. Some advisors warned that Vietnam could become a long and complicated war. Others believed the opposite. They believed that decisive action, taken quickly, could stabilize the situation before it spiraled out of control. Air power, increased military presence, stronger pressure against North Vietnam. But one event would soon push the debate forward faster than anyone expected. In August of 1964, American naval vessels operating in the Gulf of Tonkin reported being attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats. The first incident appeared to involve an actual exchange of fire. The second report was far less clear. Radar signals, confusing sonar readings, pilots describing shapes in the darkness. Even some commanders at the scene expressed uncertainty about what had truly happened. But in Washington, the moment arrived during a period of rising tension. The reports were interpreted as deliberate aggression against the United States. Within days, President Lyndon Johnson addressed the nation. He described the attacks as unprovoked acts against American forces operating in international waters. Soon after, Congress passed what became known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The resolution gave the president broad authority to take military action in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. It passed with overwhelming support. In that moment, the path toward large-scale war opened. Over the next few years, American involvement expanded dramatically. Airstrikes began against North Vietnam. Combat troops were deployed to protect bases and support operations. What had started as an advisory mission slowly transformed into a full military intervention. But years later, when documents were declassified and historians examined the events more closely, questions emerged about the Gulf of Tonkin incident itself. Evidence suggested that the second reported attack may never have occurred. Misinterpreted radar signals, bad weather, nervous crews in a tense environment. The situation was far more uncertain than the public had been told. Yet the political momentum created by the incident had already reshaped American policy. What began as a moment of confusion in dark waters had triggered a decision that would lead hundreds of thousands of American soldiers into Vietnam. And once that decision was made, turning back became far more difficult. By 1965, the war in Vietnam had entered a new phase. What had once been a limited advisory mission had now become a large-scale military operation. American combat troops were arriving in growing numbers. At first, tens of thousands. Soon, hundreds of thousands. The strategy seemed clear to many leaders in Washington. The United States possessed overwhelming military power, advanced aircraft, heavy artillery, modern communications, mobility that previous wars had never seen before. Helicopters carried soldiers deep into the countryside. Bombers flew long missions over jungle terrain. Massive bombing campaigns targeted supply routes and suspected enemy positions. The assumption behind these operations was simple. If enough pressure was applied, the enemy would eventually lose the ability, or the will, to continue fighting. But Vietnam was not a traditional battlefield. There were no clear front lines stretching across maps. No predictable movements of large armies clashing in open terrain. Instead, the conflict unfolded in small villages, dense forests, rice fields, and winding jungle paths. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces relied on tactics that had developed over years of resistance against stronger armies. They avoided large confrontations when possible. They moved quietly through terrain they knew far better than foreign soldiers. Tunnels were dug beneath villages. Supply routes stretched across neighboring countries. Fighters blended into local populations during the day and emerged at night. For American soldiers on the ground, the battlefield often felt invisible. An area could appear calm one moment and suddenly erupt into gunfire the next. Patrols walked through thick vegetation where danger could be hidden just a few steps away. Even the environment itself became an obstacle. Heat, humidity, insects, thick jungle that limited visibility and movement. Military commanders tried to measure progress through numbers. Enemy casualties, bombing targets destroyed, villages secured. These statistics became central to evaluating whether the war was being won. But the numbers often told an incomplete story. Territory captured during one operation might be abandoned days later. Villages cleared of enemy fighters might quietly return to insurgent control after troops moved on. The conflict became a cycle of operations that produced temporary results, but rarely permanent change. Meanwhile, the scale of the war continued to grow. Bombing campaigns such as Operation Rolling Thunder expanded across North Vietnam. Millions of tons of explosives were dropped over the course of the conflict. Yet even this immense firepower failed to stop the steady flow of supplies and fighters moving south. As the years passed, the war began to stretch far longer than many American leaders had predicted. What was once expected to be a limited intervention turned into a prolonged and exhausting struggle. Each year brought new troop deployments, new operations, and new strategies designed to break the stalemate. But the fundamental problem remained. The United States was fighting a conventional war strategy against an enemy that relied on unconventional tactics. Military strength alone could not easily defeat a movement deeply rooted in local terrain, political networks, and long-standing national struggles. For soldiers in the field, the reality was often confusing and exhausting. Days of quiet patrols could suddenly turn into violent encounters. Friends disappeared in moments, and victories were often difficult to define. Far from Washington, in jungles and villages thousands of miles away, the war had become something very different from what many had first imagined. It was no longer a quick demonstration of American power. It had become a long, uncertain war with no clear ending in sight. As the war stretched into the late 1960s and early 1970s, the cost of the conflict became impossible to ignore. What had once been described as a limited effort to contain communism had grown into one of the longest and most painful wars in American history. By the time U.S. combat forces began withdrawing, more than 58,000 American soldiers had lost their lives. Hundreds of thousands more returned home wounded, both physically and emotionally. Many carried injuries that would never fully heal. But the cost of the war was not measured only in American losses. Across Vietnam, millions of civilians found themselves trapped in the middle of a conflict they could not escape. Entire villages were destroyed. Farmland was scarred by bombing and chemicals. Families were separated by a war that moved unpredictably across cities, countryside, and borders. For years, the war had seemed distant to many Americans at home. It was happening thousands of miles away, in jungles few people could imagine. But slowly, that distance disappeared. Television cameras brought the war into American living rooms. Night after night, viewers watched footage of firefights, burning villages, wounded soldiers, and exhausted young men being carried onto helicopters. For the first time in history, a major war was being seen almost in real time by the public, and the images were difficult to ignore. College campuses erupted with protests. Demonstrations filled city streets. Families began questioning why the war continued when victory seemed so uncertain. The country itself grew divided. Some believed the war had to continue in order to protect American credibility and prevent the spread of communism. Others believed the war had already gone too far and was costing far more than it could ever achieve. For many soldiers returning home, the experience was deeply complicated. They had fought in a difficult and confusing war, often under extreme conditions. Yet when they returned, they sometimes found a nation that was no longer sure how to view the conflict they had been sent to fight. Some veterans were welcomed quietly by their families. Others struggled with memories of the war for decades. The psychological effects, what would later be widely recognized as post-traumatic stress, became a lasting part of the war's legacy. Meanwhile, inside government institutions, trust began to erode. Investigations, leaked documents, and historical research slowly revealed that many political leaders had understood the difficulties of the war much earlier than the public realized. Yet the conflict had continued to expand. For many Americans, Vietnam became more than a military defeat. It became a turning point in how the country viewed war, leadership, and the decisions made in distant government offices. In 1975, when Saigon finally fell and the war came to an end, the images were unforgettable. Helicopters lifting off from rooftops, crowds gathering outside embassy gates. A long and costly chapter of history, closing in a moment of urgency and uncertainty. But even after the last troops had left, the lessons of Vietnam continued to echo. Decades later, historians, military strategists, and political leaders still study the conflict. They look for patterns. They search for the moments where different decisions might have changed the outcome. And they ask a question that remains quietly relevant today. How does a powerful nation avoid repeating the same mistakes? Because history rarely returns in exactly the same form. The countries change. The enemies change. The technologies change. But fear, pressure, and uncertainty often remain the same. And sometimes, the most important lessons from a war are not learned on the battlefield. They are learned afterward, in reflection, in memory, and in the quiet hope that the next decision will be made with a clearer understanding of the past.